Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's broadcast of Saints, the Standard of Truth. We are on chapter 14, and tonight we have Jenny Dye. Jenny, how are you?
Fine, John. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's good to be with you.
Awesome. Yeah,
It's
you
just
as
you and me
well.
tonight. Just you and me.
Go figure.
Go figure. Go figure. So, actually, I am going to share this to a few pages. So, I'm going to put you on solo so you can
Okay.
do a little bit of bio work. So, tell us where you're from.
Oh gosh, where I'm from, I live in the Salt Lake City suburban area. I I'm you know that doing a bio is my least favorite thing. Yeah, I live in Salt Lake City. I'm a mom. I work in uh social media and other forms of media. And I'm a fitness instructor, and I love reading and listening to saints. I also do a podcast every week called The Mormon News Report. New name still pending. So, but check that out. Go subscribe to The Mormon News Report podcast, please. Much appreciated.
Wonderful. 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 Well, thanks for that. Yeah, you guys just
Mm-hmm.
finished another Mormon News Report episode right before we started recording tonight.
That's true.
Um, Jenny, go ahead. Let's just start on chapter 14. 14
Okay.
was kind of a tough chapter. We talked about that. It's entitled Visions and Nightmares, and for probably good reason based on what happened in chapter 14. But do you want to share a few thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So, um, I mean, in this chapter, chapter 14, Visions and Nightmares, we actually hear some of the stories that are have kind of become really well known in more general terms in in church history, and we'll get to that in just a second. But it starts out, chronologically at the beginning in January of 1832, and it talks about how Joseph and Emma and their twins were living at the Elsa and John Johnson home in Hiram, Ohio. That is south of Kirtland, about 30 miles. And they were and the Johnsons were older, kind of old enough to be Emma and Joseph's parents. So they but they had plenty of room, and not only for Joseph and Emma and the twins to live, but also for Joseph to have meetings with other leaders and work on his Bible translation. Um, they had previously been in the same congregation with Ezra Booth, but they remained faithful despite Ezra having left. The first thing that it talks about as far as visions, let me adjust that right there. It talks about Joseph and Sidney spending a lot of time translating upstairs in the Johnson home. Um, and and they were reading in John in the Bible about the resurrection of just and unjust souls. And it says Joseph wondered if there was not more to know about heaven or the salvation of humankind. If God rewarded his children according to their deeds on earth, were traditional notions of heaven and hell too simple? And so it was on February 16th when Joseph and Sidney and 12 others sat in that room upstairs at the Johnson home. And the way that I thought it was very interesting that it was described. The spirit rested on Joseph and Sidney as they grew still as a vision opened before their eyes. And then Joseph said out loud, he said, "What do I see?" And then he described what he saw in this vision. And then following that, Sidney said, "I see the same." And then he asked the same question, "What do I see?" He described what he said, and Joseph said, "I see the same." So essentially, this is two witnesses having the same vision. And the vision is described as the glory of the Lord surrounded them, and they saw Jesus Christ at the right hand of God. Angels worshipped at his throne, and a voice testified that Jesus was the only begotten of the Father. So when Joseph and Sidney were talking about, they were describing when they were describing their vision, they spoke like that for about an hour, and then essentially it was the vision was on the plan of salvation, specifically the 3 degrees of glory. Rather than, it says here in Saints, rather than being a single kingdom, it was organized into various kingdoms of glory. It expands on the Apostle Paul's description of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. And so Joseph and Sidney described the details of each kingdom, terrestrial glory, telestial glory, and celestial glory, of course. The Lord at this point gives more in this vision, but tells them not to record it. And then at the end of that section, it talks about how when they were finished, Sidney looked limp and pale, overcome by what he had seen. And Joseph smiled and said, "Sidney is not used to it as I am." Ha 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 ha. So I think of that. I mean, I think we maybe have all been in situations and meetings where the Spirit is felt very strongly. And I remember once, and I don't know, this is just a thought that I had. I remember learning one time, and again, I don't remember the source, but something about how when the Spirit is really strong in a meeting, it's actually that all of our spirits are contributing to that. And that can lead to our own sense of kind of physical exhaustion, or at least, having used up energy. Again, I don't remember the source. It's just something I remember from my younger years.
Ah, interesting. Hey, I'm going to show some pictures really quick, make these full screen of the upper room here in the Johnson home where they received Section 76. So they tried to recreate it, I think, as closely as they could. The small table on the left-hand side is where they imagine that Sidney and Joseph were. And, the way it was told to me was where the window is above the table. That's where the vision opened up, somewhere in that upper window area. So again, 12 other people in addition to, 12 people, including Sidney and Joseph, but this is the room where that happened. Now, what's so interesting, Jenny, about this, and obviously it caused some issues later on, was this a Christian notion of heaven and hell? This was quite revolutionary, right?
Yeah, this was. And in fact, later it the chapter goes into how some people, it caused quite a stir among people. Some people were so uncomfortable with this idea of, something other than just heaven and hell, that they left. Yeah. And a lot of people had already been already on their way due to the letters that Ezra Booth had been writing, kind of discrediting Joseph's character anyway. But absolutely. That is a good point too, because depending on where the saints were, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the new prophecies being revealed, were starting to diverge enough with traditional Christianity at this time. People really had to take stock and say, wow, do I believe what's being taught? Because this was such a divergent notion from traditional Christianity. So we'll read about some of the unfortunate events a little bit later on that happened to Joseph and Sidney, but many people attribute that directly to the revelation given in Doctrine and Covenants section 76 because of the divergent views on the afterlife. So anyway, kind of interesting. Yeah. Meanwhile, in Independence, William Phelps was setting up the printing press, or the printing office for the church. And this was an area in which he had his career. He had not just a strong and confident voice in his writing, but he was also used to really writing, like he wasn't afraid to share his opinion politically. But for this publication that he was planning, which he planned to call The Evening and the Morning Star, he said, "The star will borrow its light from sacred sources and be devoted to the revelations of God." And so he took this, very seriously as a call that the last days had arrived, and that there would be no political musings, even kind of as an aside, inserted into any of the literature published. And so that was his commitment to this. He also wanted to print other things like news reports and poetry. But he was, again, committed to not involve himself or engage the publication in politics or disputes or anything like that. So, and he says, from this press may be expected, as soon as wisdom directs, many sacred records. And that was his promise to his readers.
Yes. Yep. William McClellan. So yeah, absolutely. Okay.
William.
Or I'm sorry.
Phelps.
Yes, we're talking W.W. Phelps. I'm sorry. William McClellan comes in a little bit later. That's
a little bit later. So,
right.
And then back to Ohio. Sorry, did you want to say anything more about that?
Nope. I just want to correct what I wrote, because I did put William McClellan. So W.W. Phelps, yeah, is who started the Evening Star.
Yes. So then back in Ohio, like you kind of mentioned before, the vision that Joseph and Sidney had really did cause up quite a bit, because it was so contrary to the traditional Christian notion of heaven and hell. People thought it was kind of too generous. Like asking if heaven saved too many souls. And then they mention, I'll just read this directly. It says, as the sun set one evening in late March 1832, a group of men met in a brickyard half a mile from the Johnsons' home. In the kiln, the men built a fire to heat pine tar. As the sky grew darker, they covered their faces in soot and slipped away into the night. So then we get to this really difficult portion, and I would venture to say, not just of this chapter, but in our church's history at this time. Emma, so the twins that they had, I believe Julia and Joseph,
right.
they were babies, and they had measles. And so Joseph had stayed awake with them earlier in the evening so that Emma could rest. So Emma is kind of in the middle of the night. Emma's lying awake in bed, and she hears this faint tapping on the window, but she didn't think anything of it. She looked over. Joseph was asleep, obviously. And then as she kind of started to drift off to sleep, the bedroom door swung open, and some men, like about a dozen men, just charged into the room, and they grabbed Joseph and they started to drag him out from the room. Emma screamed. At one point, Joseph is able to kick one of his legs free, and he ends up kicking a guy in the face, giving him a bloody nose. But the guy, I mean, this description just is so, I mean, it reminds me of like a movie, right? Like he said, the man stumbled backward and toppled down the doorstep, clutching his bleeding nose. Laughing hoarsely, he scrambled back to his feet and shoved a bloody hand into Joseph's face. And it just, I mean, just that, that kind of evil laugh that I think we can all imagine. Mm-hmm. And so, and Joseph was a strong guy, but they carried him outside, and he wouldn't stop fighting them. So one guy put his hand around Joseph's throat and essentially constricted his airway until he just went limp. When he woke up, he was in this field or a meadow, I guess, and they were still holding him really tightly, but he was still off the ground, so that he couldn't kick up, kind of use the ground to push off of. He looked over. He saw Sidney Rigdon over, half naked, and he looked dead. And Joseph said, "Have mercy, spare my life." And of course, someone shouted, "Call on your God for help." As he looked around, he saw more men approaching the mob. One guy came out of the woods, and he had this wooden plank, and so they put him on it, and they carried him deeper into the woods. While they were walking, they tore away his clothes, and they held him down. One man approached him with a knife, But as soon as he looked at Joseph, like he had intended to mutilate him, is what the record says. But as soon as he looked at him, he couldn't cut him. So, and then another guy jumped on him and just raked his really sharp fingernails across the prophet's skin. So, breaking the skin, cutting it open, as it says, leaving it raw and lacerated. And he said, that's the way the Holy Ghost falls on folks. He could hear other people shouting in the distance. Like this mob had grown since, from the dozen men who had broken into his house to abduct him, sort of. And he heard people arguing about what to do to him in the distance. He heard a few familiar names. And then he heard one voice say, let's tar up his mouth. So all these filthy fingers pulled his mouth open. One man tried to pour a bottle of acid down Joseph's throat, and the bottle broke on Joseph's teeth. So it chipped one of his teeth. Another man tried to shove a paddle of sticky tar into his mouth. And Joseph would, just shook his head. And finally, he did get some tar onto Joseph's lips. At that point, men came over and just poured this vat of tar all over the prophet, including in his hair and over his lacerated skin from the person who had scratched him with his sharp nails. And then they covered him with feathers, and then they left the scene.
Hey, while you're discussing that, I'm going to just throw up on screen. I pulled this from Wikipedia, and this is what, who knows who took a picture of a gentleman after being tarred and feathered. This was probably in the mid to late 1800s, I would guess. I didn't look at the date, but this is what somebody looks like. Now, this is from the description. This looks like it would have been mild compared to what happened to Joseph and to Sidney. Now we hear a lot about what happened to Joseph. We don't as much to Sidney. We don't know if he was tarred and feathered. We know that he was dragged out by his feet, and because of that, he hit his head. And many people attribute that to some of his musings and rumblings, and because many people said he wasn't the same after this incident mentally.
Right.
So that could have impacted him. But this is what it looks like after one man was tarred and feathered. Again, this is from Wikipedia, but imagine this. This gentleman didn't have his mouth tarred and feathered. We know that Elsa Johnson brought out lard to try to, create some type of grease or lubricant to help get this tar off of Joseph when it occurred. But just incredible. And
yeah,
about this, Dace Rogers said because of the chipped tooth, which happened when they tried to pour poison down his throat, he spoke with a whistle after the tooth was chipped. So yeah, thanks, Dace. That totally makes
interesting
sense.
So Joseph found himself in this field, and he stood up, and first thing, he grabbed the tar off of his lips and just gasped for air and was able to catch a breath. Tried to stand up and walk and just couldn't. I mean, his strength just failed him. He fell down. Finally, he was able to stay upright, and the feathers were just kind of all around, blowing in the air. When he got back, and Emma saw him. She thought they had mutilated him beyond recognition, and she fainted. And like you mentioned, and then other women heard the commotion, and he, approached him to help, and he asked for a blanket to cover his body. For the rest of that night, people attended to Joseph and to Sidney to help heal them. Like you mentioned, Elsa Johnson used lard from her pantry to ease the hardened tar from his skin and hair. Sidney had lain in the meadow a long time, barely breathing, and Emma scraped tar from Joseph's limbs, chest, and back. And this is the part, that the next day Joseph got up, went to preach his sermon that he had planned to do. He recognized some of the men in his own congregation from the mob the night before, and he said nothing to them. And then that afternoon, Joseph went and baptized 3 people. And this part really moved me. He said, still, the attack had caused plenty of damage. His body was bruised and aching from the beating. Sidney lay in bed, delirious, teetering between life and death. The mob had dragged him out of his house by his heels, leaving his head unprotected as it bounced down the steps and across the cold march ground, which you mentioned before, John. So, like we mentioned before, the twins had the measles, and Julia had begun to get better, but baby Joseph grew worse, and later that week he died, which the prophet blamed on the rush of cold air that came in when the mob broke in to take him. So a few days after the baby's burial, Joseph gets up and goes right back to work, even in his grief. And went back to Missouri with Newell K. Whitney and Sidney Rigdon, even though they were still recovering. But they set out on the Lord's errand like they do. At that point, they went to Missouri to kind of work on. The Lord had called Newell there to kind of set up this group. What do they call the United Firm?
The United Firm.
Yeah, to kind of basically covenant to, in a business sense, seek out the good of their neighbors. So to take care of each other and to create Zion in a thoughtful way, in a way that would be profitable, would build the kingdom, would not be a stretch or a strain on the resources available. And so that's why the 3 men went there. And with Edward Partridge as well. So while he was in Missouri, Joseph also visited with the members of the old Colesville branch, and checked on the printing office. And there were a lot of members there who were really eager to get going on building up the city. But some saints were like hardened against Joseph because they didn't understand, like, okay, if we're doing this, then why are you still staying in Kirtland? And I just thought it was so interesting. Like, I love this paragraph. Their resentment surprised him. Did they not realize he had left his grieving family and traveled 800 miles just to help them? And then
that's interesting. And I think what's interesting to me here is obviously he's very much involved in the work. This is just a few days after this horrific incident, which if this happened now, we'd recover from this for weeks, right? Any doctor would say, wow, take a couple of weeks off at least. And it's a few days after the baby's burial that Joseph and Newell and Sidney go there. And to that point, I understand, that would be hard to understand. You said this is Zion in Missouri, yet you're over here in Kirtland. What's going on? If you didn't understand the plan, that would be hard to maybe stomach. But it's so hard to imagine that they couldn't show some empathy or sympathy for Joseph, who literally just left his grieving family. I can't imagine Emma. I mean, what are your thoughts about how Emma may have, again, we know depicted in the movie Jane and Emma, it shows, I think, somewhat realistically, her concern and some of her thoughts on sharing her husband with the church. Joseph was her husband, but he was the prophet. But boy, lots of traveling, and right after this, what are your thoughts about that, Jenny?
I have a lot of thoughts about that because bearing a child, it, that is so hard to deal with. And, men and women grieve very differently. And that's a time when, when I'm sure Emma just needed so much support, which isn't to say that there weren't saints there where she was to support them. But I mean, the more I learn about Emma, the more I'm just so touched by her faith and her devotion. And it must have been difficult for Joseph to leave as well. I'm sure he was grieving and mourning in his own way and wanted to be with his sweet wife and family.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Yeah, go ahead. Did you want to talk about William or give some additional thought?
Last chapter or two, we met William McClellan, who was a teacher and had lost his own family. He was a widow who had lost his wife and young child, and was quite kind of an intellectual, and joined the church, studied the church out pretty thoroughly, and then talked with Hiram and ended up joining the church. Not just because it made sense to him, but also because he had received witnesses of the truthfulness of the gospel. Well, he was on a mission, and he's a teacher and he's used to students who are obedient and listening to him in his classroom. But on a mission, people are kind of, I don't know the exact situation, but the equivalent of like today's missionaries having doors slammed in their faces and people talking back and saying what you're saying isn't true. He was even, it says, called a liar. He was just at odds with people. And it really affected his faith. So he just decided to take a break from his mission, even though he'd been called on one. And he found a job just working at a store. And in his free time, he was studying the Bible, just kind of scouring it for more evidence of the restored gospel. But he would also be arguing with people. In the end, he ended up choosing to not return to his mission. He did marry a woman who was a church member. Her name was Emmeline Miller. And together they joined a company of about 100 saints who headed out to Jackson County, Missouri. Now, the problem here is that they went out there. There was kind of a system, again, in place for establishing Zion, which they went out there and what they were supposed to do was get a recommendation. So I'm guessing like almost kind of like a mission call to go there. Like you're called to go to Missouri. And the Lord wanted that so that Zion wouldn't grow too quickly and it wouldn't be a strain on the resources. And even though the Lord rebuked William for abandoning his mission, he just thought he could just start over again in Missouri. And he even wrote letters home testifying of the truthfulness of the restored gospel, testifying that Joseph Smith was a prophet and a man of God. He, again, did not go through the channels that the Lord had established for the saints to establish Zion. He bought two lots in Independence straight from the government. And it made this because there were about 500 saints. And so this addition of 100 saints really put a pretty immediate strain on the economy, which made the people who were already there, very, very upset. All their own prices were going up on what they were buying locally. One woman said, and this is how the chapter ends, "They are crowding in. I do think they ought to be punished." So this chapter was, a lot of really kind of hard things, and that doesn't bode well for what the next chapter or chapters might bring.
Yeah, that the foreshadowing of that last sentence, they are crowding in. they ought to be punished. Shows you, I think, what's in store, at least for the next chapter. Well, let's talk about takeaways. Just the two biggest takeaways that you would have from this chapter, what would they be based on the things we've discussed tonight?
So the two biggest takeaways that I would have are Joseph's example of, I mean, we talked today in church about humility and meekness, and it's really easy to, kind of in our world today, be more isolated and stand for what's right in our own ways, and kind of think through scenarios where our faith might be challenged. And this was a situation where, based on his faith, Joseph was not just challenged, he was physically harmed. He could have died. He could have been killed that night.
Easily.
And so his example that somehow throughout all that, and all the men are yelling at him, damn you, that he has this, he does ask for mercy and for his life to be spared, but he not only doesn't, he doesn't, let me be clear, he doesn't just take it. When they were trying to shove things in his mouth, he shook his head back and forth. But he did, he was proactive in being in a place where the very next day he could not only deliver a sermon to some of those mob members, but he could also baptize 3 people, enough to be in the frame of mind and of spirit and be ready that he could perform baptisms. And along with that, I would say that he had enough humility that didn't harden him towards people, even when he sensed that some of the saints in Missouri were having hard feelings towards him. Again, I love that line that he said, their resentment surprised him. It's not like that experience with the mob made him bitter toward humanity and suspicious of people all along, which I think for a lot of people it would. So that, but then Emma's faith. This woman gave her life for the gospel in so many ways. And that includes, she, to lose a child, to bury a child is no small thing. The fact that the actions of these evil men essentially killed her son.
Right.
And again, it doesn't say specifically too much about what Emma did, other than that Joseph had to leave his family. But as a mom who has buried a son, I don't know how much needs to be said to just understand the need to honor her and her faith and her actions in continuing along the path.
Yeah, that's great. Good takeaways. I'll just add a few, because I do believe you hit on, the things that Joseph went through. This, I think about it, had he not believed and had he not seen what he said he saw, why would you continue in doing what he did? Literally getting up the next day, giving a sermon, baptizing others, continuing to go through the persecution that he went through from those inside the church and outside the church, quite honestly. Why would you do that? That for me further testifies to his call as being a prophet, something he couldn't refute, he couldn't deny, he couldn't step away from. Because again, going through this, boy, he could have easily turned his back and said, wow, this Heavenly Father, this is not for me. But he didn't do that. And Emma, to your point, was one strong woman as well, and obviously knew her part in the restoration too. I believe she was figuring that out and knew she had to be by Joseph's side and assist in all the things only she could do. The other thing that I would say is a big takeaway from me was William McClellan. It's interesting to me because here's a man that, we talk about early return to missionaries in the church sometimes. In essence, that's what William McClellan was, an early return missionary who decided to stay with the saints. To his credit, decided to continue to live with the saints. He didn't necessarily go about it the way that it was requested, and there were some other things there, but we know that he had some important things that he had done and yet to do in the restoration. And so I think this is an example of someone who, didn't necessarily follow the path, or specifically didn't do what the Lord had asked him to do in Revelation through Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody
Right.
who could
Specifically
stay with
for him.
Exactly. It was directed specifically to him. Again, he started to question whether it was the Lord or Joseph Smith who had called him on a mission. He chose not to return to his mission. You discussed that. Married another church member, and they went back to Kirtland. But again, I think this shows that even though he didn't do exactly what was requested of him by the Lord through Joseph, there's still a spot for him in Zion. And again, he continued to do things. I think the modern day corollary to that is, sometimes we all fail in some way, shape, or form in our lives, specifically as it pertains to the gospel. But there is room for all of us. And Zion is big enough for all of us. And obviously we want to be obedient. That's the first law of heaven. But even when we're not, we know that forgiveness is possible, and we can do things because of forgiveness and the atonement of Jesus Christ. So that was a big takeaway for me as well.
I have one more if I can.
Please.
Okay. It's that back at the beginning when, or toward earlier in the chapter, said, back in Ohio, Joseph and Sidney's vision was causing a stir. Many saints quickly embraced the newly revealed truths about heaven, but others had a hard time squaring the vision with their traditional Christian beliefs. And we talked about that earlier, but that right there is a takeaway for us as well, because President Nelson, recently said, tweeted, whatever, if you think that these changes were big, essentially buckle up, get some rest, eat your vitamins, get ready, because there's a lot coming. And I think that it is a great reminder for all of us to ask ourselves exactly those questions. Like you said, why would Joseph do this if it weren't true, if he hadn't seen what he said he saw? Why are each of us here? Do we believe what we say we believe? Are we going to do what we've said we're going to do, and why?
Absolutely. In closing, I will just read a few of the comments. Dace Rogers, watching from Mesa, Arizona. I believe that if it were not for the trials they went through, they would not have the faith they did. Sometimes our trials define our faith. Absolutely. Marianne Natras says, I have so much love and appreciation for Joseph and Emma. They sacrificed so much for the restoration of the gospel. Want to give a quick verbal shout out to some people. We have Joseph Iguaran Vega from Sweden watching. We also had Lorimer from the Philippines, Heather McCabe from Massachusetts here in the USA, Leon from New Zealand. So those are just a few of the individuals watching from different spots around the world. So thanks for joining us. So every week we go through at least one chapter of Saints. Next week we'll at least go through 15, maybe 15 and 16. We'll have some additional guests on, so make sure you join us. Any parting words, Jenny?
I don't think so. Thanks for having me tonight.
All right, it was great. And make sure you guys comment below with anything else you want to talk about, and we'll respond to those comments. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week.